Her father used her to settle a blood debt, but the ruthless alpha I was given to her. Mist hung low over the kingdom of Veyrath, curling around jagged cliffs and dark forests like a shroud. The wind carried a chill that seemed to whisper secrets of the past, secrets that no one dared speak aloud. In a small, crumbling manor at the edge of the capital, Alara sat by a narrow window, staring at the distant silhouette of Kaelin's fortress. Her heart pounded in her chest, a rhythm of fear and dread that had been growing for days. Her father, Lord Thuron, paced the room behind her. His face was pale, lined with worry and shame. He had gambled one too many times with nobles whose ambitions far outweighed their honor. Now his life rested on a debt he could not repay in coin. Instead, he had chosen a darker path, a path that led to his daughter. "Alara," he said, his voice tight, almost breaking, "I have no choice. The blood debt, it must be settled. You are to be given to Kaelin." Alara's eyes widened. The name alone carried weight. Kaelin, the Alpha of the Northhold, the man whose very presence silenced the courts, whose cruelty was legend. But even more terrifying was the whisper of power surrounding him, the dark magic said to run through his veins, the ability to bend others to his will. "Father, you can't," she said, her voice trembling. He's dangerous. I can't." "You can't stop what has been set in motion," Thuron interrupted, his hands shaking. "I've begged, I've pleaded, but they will not wait. They will take my life if I fail to deliver you. I swear, Alara, this is for the survival of our house. I wish it were not so." Alara's stomach turned. Survival for him meant a lifetime of fear for her. Her mind raced, looking for a way out, but the walls of the manor, the debts of the past, and the power of the Northern Alpha closed in like the mist outside. She had never felt so small, so powerless. That evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, Thuron escorted Alara to a waiting carriage. Black horses with eyes like coals pulled them through the winding roads toward Kaelin's fortress. The journey was silent, the only sound the clatter of hooves and the occasional howl of a distant wolf. Alara clutched the edge of her cloak, the fabric scratching her palms. She stared at the looming silhouette of the fortress, its dark spires clawing at the stormy sky. Kaelin's guards met them at the gates. They were tall, silent men whose eyes seemed to pierce through every lie and pretense. They did not speak as they led Alara through stone halls, their footsteps echoing in a rhythm that made her heart tighten. Finally, she was brought before Kaelin himself. He stood by a grand window, the pale moonlight striking his face in sharp angles. His hair was dark as midnight, and his eyes held a depth of power and pain that unsettled her. He did not smile, yet his gaze seemed to weigh her soul. "You are Alara," he said, his voice low, controlled, yet carrying an authority that made her knees weak. "Your father has given you to me as payment for his foolish choices. Tell me, how do you feel about that?" I don't have a choice," she stammered. "You, Kaelin, you're dangerous." He tilted his head slightly, studying her. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, amusement, curiosity, perhaps even interest. "Dangerous," he echoed. "Perhaps, but so is the world we live in. And yet here you are, delivered to me, trembling at my doorstep. Tell me, Alara, are you afraid of me, or of the fate your father forced upon you?" She had no answer. Fear and anger battled inside her. She wanted to scream at him, to strike back at the injustice of her situation. Yet beneath the fear, a strange awareness began to grow, a sense that Kaelin, for all his power, was not a monster born from cruelty alone. He carried his own chains, hidden from the world, yet visible in the shadows of his eyes. The first night in the fortress was suffocating. She was given a small room with a window that looked out over the jagged cliffs. The wind howled through the cracks, carrying with it the scent of pine and distant snow. Alara could not sleep. She kept thinking about her father's pale face, about the gamble that had stolen her freedom, about the man she was promised to. When she finally drifted into a restless sleep, a soft knock at the door woke her. She rose cautiously. To her surprise, Kalen stood there unannounced, his cloak still damp from the night air. "You should not wander these halls alone," he said quietly. His voice was firm, yet there was no anger in it. "The fortress is not kind to those unfamiliar with its rules." I wasn't wandering," she whispered, though she was tense. I couldn't sleep." "Neither could I," he admitted. For a moment he seemed human, stripped of the mask of power and fear. "Perhaps you would like to walk with me. The halls are long and the night is heavy." Alara hesitated, but something in his tone eased her fear. She followed him through the echoing corridors, past grand halls lined with tapestries that depicted battles and old kings long forgotten. Kalen walked silently, but she could sense the tension in every step he took. He was a man who commanded the air around him, yet he walked as if carrying a burden far heavier than the world's expectations. "You are brave," he said suddenly, "or foolish, perhaps both." "I have no choice," she replied, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "My father he chose for me." "And yet," he said, turning to face her, "you do not run, you do not beg. There is a fire in you, small but persistent. That fire, it intrigues me." Alara's heart fluttered, a strange warmth mingling with the fear. She wanted to hate him, to despise the man who had inherited her father's debt. Yet, in his presence, she felt something else, an awareness that this was not just a man who demanded obedience. He was complex, haunted, capable of both destruction and protection, and that made him all the more terrifying. The night passed slowly. Alara lay awake, listening to the distant howls and the wind against the stone. Her thoughts returned to the shadows she had glimpsed outside her window, shapes that seemed almost alive, almost watching. She realized with a shiver that the fortress was not merely a stronghold. It was a living entity, connected to Kalen, connected to something ancient and powerful that she could not yet understand. When morning came, the sunlight struggled to pierce the heavy mist that clung to the fortress walls. Kalen did not speak to her immediately, but the intensity in his eyes lingered. Over breakfast, a silent tension hung between them, like a storm waiting to break. He watched her closely, his presence filling the room, and she felt both exposed and noticed in a way that made her uneasy. Later, she was escorted to the training halls, not as a warrior but as a guest of the Alpha. There, she witnessed Kalen's power in motion. Men and women trained under his command, their movements precise, disciplined, yet somehow alive with a dangerous grace. Kalen himself moved among them like a shadow, his presence alone bending the room to his will. Alara's stomach tightened as she realized the depth of the man she had been given to. This was not a ruler to bargain with, not a man to plead with. He was a force of nature, dangerous, untouchable, and yet he was drawn to her. She could feel it in every glance, every measured step he took toward her. By evening, Alara returned to her chamber, exhausted and overwhelmed. She sat by the window, watching the moon rise over the distant mountains. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a sense of something greater, something ancient that watched their lives like threads woven into a tapestry she could not yet read. Her thoughts turned reluctantly to Kalen. He was fearsome, yes, but he was also human, in the glimpses she had seen. A man bound by duty, by power, and by a darkness that seemed almost impossible to escape. And yet, somewhere beneath that darkness, a flicker of something else existed, a man who could be saved, perhaps, if only she dared to reach him. As the night deepened, a shadow moved across the fortress walls. Alara's heart skipped. A whisper carried her name, soft but deliberate, echoing in the hallways beyond her room. She pressed herself against the window, peering into the darkness. Something ancient stirred, a presence that seemed older than the kingdom, older than Kalen's bloodline. It whispered promises, warnings, secrets that twisted through the mist. Alara shivered, realizing that her father's debt was far more than a simple promise to an alpha. It was tied to something deeper, darker, a force that had watched over Kalen's family for generations. And as she stood there, alone but not entirely unprotected, she understood one thing with terrifying clarity. The choice her father had made would not only bind her to Kaelin, but to a destiny she could neither predict nor escape. Yet within the fear, a stubborn ember of courage burned. Elara clenched her fists, whispering to herself, "I will survive this, and I will find a way to be more than a pawn." The wind carried her words into the night as if answering her own defiance. Somewhere in the shadows of Kaelin's fortress, the Alpha watched. And for the first time, Elara felt the pull of something unexpected, something dangerous, powerful, and entirely beyond her control. The morning light in Kaelin's fortress was pale and cold, slipping through the tall windows like silver knives. Mist still clung to the courtyard, curling around the stone walls and statues of past rulers, their faces frozen in time and shadow. Elara stood at the edge of the balcony, her hands gripping the cold stone, her thoughts heavy with the memory of the shadow she had glimpsed the night before. She could not stop thinking about it, the figure that had whispered her name from the tower. It was not Kaelin. And yet it had seemed alive, aware of her, as if it had been waiting for her all along. Her pulse quickened as she considered the possibility that her father's debt had pulled her into forces far older and darker than she had imagined. Her reflection in the glass of the window showed a pale, tense face framed by dark hair. Elara did not recognize herself. She was no longer just a daughter of a desperate father. She had crossed into Kaelin's world, into a world where power and fear intertwined, and where every choice carried consequences she could not yet understand. Kaelin appeared behind her, his presence silent but undeniable. He did not touch her, but the air shifted as he stepped closer. "You are thinking about last night," he said quietly. His voice was low, deliberate, carrying the weight of authority and something softer, almost human, beneath it. I saw something," she admitted. "A shadow, a figure, it whispered my name." Kaelin's dark eyes narrowed, and for a moment his usual calm demeanor flickered. "The fortress has many secrets," he said, his voice almost cautious. "And not all of them are friendly. You are not yet ready to know the full truth. But you are aware now that this place is not like anywhere else." Elara nodded. "I feel it. Everything here, it watches and it waits." "Yes," Kaelin agreed, his gaze scanning the horizon. "And it waits for moments like these, moments when those who enter my world are tested. It is not enough to survive my fortress. One must survive the darkness within it and within oneself." The words unsettled her. She felt as if she had crossed into a place where life and death, fear and desire, mingled in ways she could not yet control. Yet there was something magnetic about Kaelin's presence, something that drew her closer even as it terrified her. That afternoon, Kaelin decided to show Elara the extent of his domain. The fortress was more than stone and walls. It was a living testament to power, history, and ancient bloodlines. He led her through the halls lined with tapestries depicting battles, pacts, and kings who had once ruled with iron fists. In the library, massive tomes with leather-bound covers and gilded letters spoke of the magic that ran through the land and through Kaelin's own bloodline. "You see," he said, his hand hovering over a book etched with runes, "my ancestors were bound by a pact, one that shaped our lives and the lives of those around us. The blood debt your father paid, it is connected to this pact. It is not merely a promise to an alpha. It is a chain that links us to powers older than Veyrath itself." Elara's eyes widened. "I don't understand. Why would anyone make such a pact?" "Power, survival, fear," Kaelin said softly. "Each generation chooses its own chains, often without realizing the consequences. The stronger the desire, the heavier the cost, and sometimes the cost falls not on those who choose, but on those who are innocent." Elara's throat tightened. She was beginning to understand that her father's choice had not only endangered her body, but had tethered her soul to a destiny that might be impossible to escape. And yet, a strange curiosity bloomed within her. She wanted to know the truth. She wanted to see the man behind the alpha, the darkness behind the power. Over the next several days, Kalen's behavior toward her was a careful balance of control and fascination. He tested her limits, pushing her to endure the fortress and its rituals, yet he did not break her. In moments of quiet, he allowed her glimpses of his own vulnerabilities, the weight of his legacy, the loneliness of command, the fear of becoming the monster the world believed him to be. One evening, as the storm clouds gathered over the mountains, Kalen led Alara to the training yard. Torches flickered along the walls, casting long shadows across the cobblestones. Warriors practiced in silence, their movements precise and disciplined. Kalen moved among them like a shadow himself, observing, correcting, commanding without words. "You will not fight," he said, turning to her, "but you will observe. You will learn the strength of the body, the mind, and the will. Power is not only in the sword or the spell, but in the courage to stand when all odds are against you." Alara nodded, feeling a mixture of fear and determination. She watched as Kalen demonstrated a series of combat maneuvers, his movements fluid yet deadly. It was not merely physical strength she observed, but an aura of command, a presence that bent reality in subtle, unspoken ways. He was ruthless, yes, but not without purpose. Later, she found herself wandering the fortress halls, unable to resist the pull of the shadows that seemed to follow her. She reached the high tower where she had glimpsed the shadow before. The air was thick, charged with energy she could feel in her bones. And there in the corner of the room stood Kalen as if he had anticipated her arrival. "You are drawn to it," he said, his voice calm but edged with warning. "The darkness calls to those who walk between fear and courage. It will test you, and it will test me." "I don't know if I want to be tested," she whispered. "Then you will fail," he replied simply. "And yet you continue to walk forward. That is what intrigues me most." Their eyes met, and for a moment the air seemed to shimmer. Neither spoke of the strange tension between them, the pull that went beyond fear or duty. It was in their silence, in the way their gazes lingered, in the unspoken acknowledgement of shared isolation and unspoken longing. The next night, a new danger emerged. A rogue entity, born from the ancient curse that haunted Kalen's family, crept through the fortress. Shadows moved unnaturally along the walls, whispers slithered through the corridors, and a chill settled deep in Alara's bones. She was not alone. Kalen sensed it immediately, his posture shifting, his eyes blazing with alert intensity. He took her hand without warning, guiding her to a hidden chamber within the fortress walls. The room was small, lined with enchanted wards that glowed faintly in the darkness. Here the Alpha's power was concentrated, and the presence of the supernatural force was muted. "You must learn," he said, his voice low and urgent, "that the world we live in is not kind. The forces that brought you here are older and more dangerous than anything you have imagined, and they will not wait for us to be ready." Alara's heart raced. Why are you helping me?" she asked. Kalen looked at her with a complexity she could not name. "Because I cannot afford to let this darkness claim you, and because I see something in you that even I cannot ignore. Your courage, your defiance, it reminds me that even the strongest chains can be broken." Her stomach tightened. She had not expected such words, such vulnerability. And yet, in his presence, the fortress felt slightly less suffocating, the shadows less oppressive. For the first time, she sensed that Kalen was not merely her captor. He was a man bound by his own fears, his own curse, and that somehow made him human. As the storm outside raged, Alara and Kalen remained in the chamber, two figures in the glow of ancient magic and torches. The air between them was taut with unspoken emotions, a silent acknowledgement of the dangerous bond forming. Each recognized the peril of their growing connection, yet neither could deny it. Hours passed, the storm subsiding, leaving a heavy silence in its wake. Alara finally spoke. "I don't understand all of this," she admitted. The curse of the shadows, my father's debt, I feel lost. Kaelin placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, not in dominance but in something gentler, a rare gesture of reassurance. You are not lost, he said quietly. You are beginning to understand, and that is the first step towards survival and perhaps even freedom. Alara shivered, not from the cold but from the intensity of his gaze, the weight of his words, and the strange hope that flickered in her chest. For the first time, she believed that she might endure this world, that she might survive the fortress and its darkness. But as she returned to her chamber, closing the heavy door behind her, a shadow lingered at the edge of the window. The figure from the tower had returned, more defined now, yet still shrouded in mystery. Its whisper carried on the wind, a soft echo that promised revelations, trials, and dangers yet unseen. Alara pressed her hands to the cold glass, her heart pounding. She understood, with a mixture of dread and determination, that her journey was only beginning. The bond forming with Kaelin, the darkness stirring within the fortress, and the shadow that haunted her nights, all were pieces of a larger puzzle she had no choice but to solve. And somewhere deep in the fortress, Kaelin watched. His mind was a storm of strategy, fear, and something he could not name. For the first time in years, someone, Alara, had stirred the dormant humanity within him. And that stirring, though fragile, was enough to ignite hope, even amidst the shadows of their cursed world. The fortress of Kaelin loomed like a sentinel over the northern cliffs, its stone walls darkened by years of storms and shadow. The wind carried a biting chill, whipping through the courtyards and corridors, and the sky above was heavy with clouds that promised both rain and lightning. Alara walked through the halls with a newfound wariness. She had begun to understand the true scope of Kaelin's power and the darkness that lingered just beyond the edges of the fortress. The curse that haunted Kaelin's bloodline was stirring. She could feel it in the air, a subtle vibration in the stone beneath her feet, a whisper in the wind that seemed to echo through the fortress. Shadows moved differently now, shifting and stretching as if alive, and Alara could not shake the feeling that something ancient and dangerous watched her every step. Kaelin appeared without warning, his presence as commanding and silent as always. His dark eyes studied her, and for a moment Alara felt the weight of his gaze pressing against her chest. "You sense it," he said quietly, reading her thoughts. "The curse awakens. Its power grows stronger every day, and with it the danger." Alara nodded, unable to speak. She had tried to prepare herself, but the sensation of the curse, like cold fingers trailing over her skin, was more terrifying than anything she had imagined. "You must decide," Kaelin continued, his voice low and tense, "whether to run from it or to face it. The choice will define more than your fate, it will define mine as well." She began, then faltered. The thought of running had crossed her mind countless times, but every step she had taken in the fortress, every encounter with Kaelin, had taught her that escape was not simple. The darkness that bound them was relentless, and it seemed determined to test her limits. "You will not be alone," he said, his tone softer now, almost gentle. "I will not let it claim you, but you must trust me." Alara swallowed, unsure if trust was possible after all she had endured. And yet beneath the fear, a spark of something stronger glimmered, hope perhaps, or courage born of necessity. She nodded, a silent agreement to face the danger, whatever form it might take. The following night the curse revealed its full force. A storm unlike any before descended upon the fortress. Lightning split the sky, and thunder shook the stone walls. Shadows poured into the halls like living mist, moving with intent, whispering words that clawed at Alara's mind. She could hear them calling her name, tempting her, warning her, and in that moment she understood the true weight of the forces surrounding Kaelin. Kaelin was at her side in an instant. He moved with a precision born of years of command and battle, his presence a shield against the encroaching darkness. His hands guided her through the storm, pushing her to safety within the hidden chambers of the fortress. "You are stronger than you realize," he said, his voice steady against the chaos. "And you are braver than most. That is why you are still here." Alara's heart raced, not from fear alone, but from the closeness of Kalen, from the strength in his hands and the intensity in his eyes. She realized in that moment that the danger was not just in the curse, but in the bond that had grown between them, an invisible thread of trust, fear, and something far more profound. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. The curse's power was relentless, and the fortress seemed to react to it, walls creaking, torches flickering, shadows deepening. Alara trained alongside Kalen, learning not just the ways of defense but the subtle art of controlling fear and focus. She began to understand the delicate balance of power, the ways in which strength could be both a weapon and a shield. Kalen, for his part, allowed himself to reveal more than he ever had to another soul. He spoke of his ancestors, of the price of the pact that had cursed his family, of the isolation and burden that had shaped him into the alpha the kingdom feared. His words were not always gentle, and sometimes they were harsh, but beneath them lay honesty, a vulnerability he rarely showed. One evening, as the sun set in flames across the horizon, Kalen led Alara to the edge of the cliffs. The wind was fierce, tugging at her hair and cloak, but she did not resist. Kalen's hand rested lightly on her shoulder, steadying her, grounding her. "The curse," he said, his voice almost lost to the wind, "is more than a shadow or a whisper. It is a chain, forged in blood and fear, and it binds us in ways we cannot yet fully understand. But chains, even the strongest chains, can be broken." Alara turned to him, searching his face. "And if we fail?" she asked, though her voice was firmer than she expected. Kalen's gaze darkened, a mixture of regret and determination flashing in his eyes. "Then we face the consequences together. That is the only way." Their eyes met, and in the silence, a quiet understanding passed between them. The danger outside, the darkness within the fortress, the ancient curse that threatened both their lives, it did not matter in that moment. What mattered was the fragile, growing bond that tied them together, a bond that neither fully understood but could not deny. The following night brought the greatest test yet. Alara was drawn into the cursed forest that bordered the northern edge of Kalen's lands, a place where the air was thick with magic, and the shadows seemed to have a life of their own. She could feel the presence of the force that had haunted Kalen's family for generations, a power older than the kingdom, darker than anything she had imagined. Kalen insisted on accompanying her, his expression grim but unwavering. The forest was treacherous, the ground uneven and tangled with roots, the air heavy with a scent of earth and decay. Shadows shifted with unnatural intent, and whispers grew louder, echoing from all directions. "This is where the curse is strongest," Kalen said, his hand brushing against hers as he guided her through the underbrush. "Stay close, trust me." Alara nodded, her grip tightening on his arm. She could feel her own fear rising, but she also felt a strange sense of determination. She was no longer merely a pawn in her father's debt. She was a participant in her own fate, standing beside the man who had become both protector and enigma. Deep within the forest, they encountered the source of the curse, a spectral figure, tall and shrouded in mist, with eyes that glowed like embers in the darkness. Its voice was a whisper that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "You should not be here," it hissed. "The debt is not yours to settle, the chain is eternal." Kalen stepped forward, his presence radiating power. "You will not touch her," he said, his voice like steel. "She is under my protection. You will not claim her as you have claimed others." The figure recoiled, its form twisting and stretching like smoke in the wind. Alara could feel the pressure of its power, the weight of centuries of anger and vengeance. But she also felt Kalen's hand on hers, steadying her, sharing strength. Together, they faced the entity. Kalen's command of his power and Alara's courage created a bond that neither the curse nor the shadows could break. They moved as one, a dance of light and will against darkness, and for a moment the forest itself seemed to hold its breath. When the spectral figure finally receded into the mist, Alara and Kalen were left standing in the clearing, panting, their hands still entwined. For the first time, Alara saw the exhaustion etched on Kalen's face, the weight of his legacy, the burden of his curse, and the danger he had faced to protect her. "You are stronger than I imagined," Kalen said, his voice low, almost in awe, "and braver. But this is only the beginning. The curse will not rest, and neither will the shadows." Alara met his gaze, her own resolve hardening. "Then we face it together," she said, her voice steady, "no matter what comes." Kalen studied her for a long moment, his eyes dark and unreadable. Then, with a rare softness, he nodded. "Together," he agreed. They returned to the fortress, the first light of dawn breaking through the storm clouds. The world seemed quieter, but Alara knew that the true battle was far from over. The curse still lingered, the shadows still whispered, and the bond between her and Kalen had grown into something that neither could ignore. A fragile thread of trust, desire, and something deeper, more dangerous than either had anticipated. That night, as Alara lay in her chamber, she thought of the shadowed figure in the tower, of the whispers in the forest, and of Kalen's hand in hers. Fear and longing twisted together in her chest, a mixture she could neither name nor resist. The journey was far from over, and the darkness that surrounded them was only growing stronger. Dawn rose slowly over the northern cliffs, painting the sky in pale gold and gray. The fortress of Kalen stood quiet, as if holding its breath. For the first time since Alara had arrived, the shadows did not whisper at sunrise. Instead, they waited. Alara stood alone in the high chamber, her hands resting against the cold stone wall. She could feel it now more clearly than ever. The curse was no longer hidden. It pulsed through the fortress like a living thing, restless and hungry. The bond between her and Kalen had changed something, and the darkness knew it. Kalen entered without sound. His face looked older somehow, marked by sleepless nights and heavy decisions. His power still surrounded him, but there was strain beneath it, like a blade pushed too far. "It is time," he said quietly. Alara turned to face him. Fear stirred in her chest, but it did not rule her, not anymore. "The curse is reaching its end," she said. "I can feel it." Kalen nodded. "So can I. It will demand a final price." They stood in silence, both knowing the truth they had avoided. The ancient pact that cursed Kalen's bloodline could not be broken without sacrifice. It had been built on fear and control, and it fed on obedience. "Alara," Kalen said, his voice tight, "if you wish to leave before this begins, I will not stop you." She stepped closer, her eyes steady. "You once told me chains can be broken." "Yes," he replied, "but not without pain." "Then let it hurt," she said softly. "I am not running." For a long moment, Kalen said nothing. Then he bowed his head, not as an alpha, not as a ruler, but as a man who had finally reached the edge of his strength. The ritual chamber lay beneath the fortress, carved into the mountain itself. Ancient symbols glowed faintly along the walls, etched by hands long turned to dust. This was where the pact had been forged generations ago. This was where fear had become law. The moment they stepped inside, the air grew heavy. Shadows rose from the stone, twisting into the shape Alara now recognized. The spectral figure emerged fully, its voice layered with countless echoes. "The debt comes due," it said. "Blood must answer blood. Power must answer power." Kalen stepped forward, his presence commanding even now. "I will end this," he said. "No more lives will be bound by this curse." The entity laughed, a sound like cracking stone. "You cannot undo what was chosen. Your line was built on this pact. Without it, you are nothing." Alara felt the weight of those words press against Kalen. For so long he had believed them. Power had been his shield, his prison, his identity. She stepped beside him. "He is not nothing," Alara said. Her voice was calm, but it carried. "You fed on fear. But fear is no longer ruling him. The The shadows recoiled slightly, as if uncertain. The entity turned its gaze on her. "You are the offering," it said. "The debt was paid with you. Your fate belongs to the chain." Alara's heart raced, but she did not step back. "I was given," she said, "but I was never owned." The symbols along the walls began to flicker. Kalen looked at her sharply. "Alara, no," she took his hand. "This ends when you choose something different." The entity hissed, sensing the shift. "Then choose," it demanded. "Power or loss?" Kalen closed his eyes. For generations, his family had chosen power, control, survival at any cost. That choice had made him feared, respected, alone. He opened his eyes and let the power go. The change was immediate. The air cracked like ice breaking. The symbols burned bright, then began to fade. The shadows screamed, twisting violently. "No," the entity roared. "You will fall without me." "Then I will fall free," Kalen said. The darkness surged toward Alara. Kalen moved without thought, stepping between her and the curse. The force struck him hard, driving him to his knees. Pain tore through him as centuries of binding power ripped away. "Alara," he shouted. She ran to him, gripping his shoulders. "Stay with me." The entity weakened, its form unraveling. "You choose love," it snarled. "It will ruin you." "No," Alara said, her voice breaking but strong. "It will change us." With a final echoing cry, the shadow collapsed inward, pulled back into the stone where it had been born. The chamber fell silent. The symbols went dark. The curse was gone. Kalen collapsed forward, his strength drained. Alara held him, her tears falling freely now. "It's over," she whispered. For a long moment he did not move. Fear clenched her heart. Then he breathed. Slowly, Kalen lifted his head. The weight in his eyes was gone. The power that once surrounded him was quieter now, human. "I am still here," he said softly. Alara laughed through her tears. "You always were." The days that followed felt unreal. The fortress changed. Without the curse, the shadows faded, the walls seemed lighter, the air easier to breathe. The people noticed. Whispers spread, not of fear but of awe. Kalen no longer ruled through terror. He listened. He learned. He rebuilt. Alara was no longer a debt or an offering. She walked beside him openly, not behind, not below. Some looked at her with curiosity, others with respect. One evening, they stood together on the cliffs where the wind carried no whispers now. "I was raised to believe I was only valuable as payment," Alara said quietly. Kalen turned to her. "And I was raised to believe I was only worthy through power." He took her hand. "We were both wrong." She smiled, resting her head against his shoulder. The future was uncertain. The kingdom would test them. The past would leave scars. But they were no longer chained to fear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Alara felt something settle within her. Not destiny, not fate, choice. And this time it was hers.